Well, good morning, everyone. I think you'll agree with me. That was just a superb panel in so many ways and really fully justifies the unique approach that Alejandro Werner, the team at the Georgetown Americas Institute have taken in setting up this forum on the Americas and the world to look at Latin America and the Caribbean in a wider context, more important today than ever. And in a sense, we're going to be going deeper on one of the key themes that emerged and that you all kept coming back to, which is China. And we'll be doing it, I think, in a very fascinating way by looking at China's worldview. How does the world look from China? How do US-China relations look from China? How does Latin America look from China? And we've got Min-Shin Pei here, one of the world's foremost experts, to help us through those questions. But first, let me introduce myself very briefly. Tom Banshoff. I'm the Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown. And in that role, work closely with the Georgetown Americas Institute and the team. I also work with colleagues across the university on our initiative for US-China dialogue on global issues. And Asia, East Asia, and China, along with Latin America, are real areas of focus and interest for Georgetown as a university, for our faculty and our students. So this session allows us to bring all of that together, I think, in some fascinating ways. And as I said, to build on the earlier conversation. So let me introduce our guest. Really, Min-Shin, really delighted that you could join us. Welcome to Georgetown. You are the Tom and Margot Pritzker Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College, and you've previously served as Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and as Director of its China program. And before that, among other honors and activities, you were the inaugural Library of Congress Chair on US-China relations. You're the author of many books. I'm just going to share the titles of the three most recent. From 2016, China's Crony Capitalism, The Dynamics of Regime Decay. More recently, in 2024, The Sentinel State, Surveillance and the Survival of Dictatorship in China. And this year, Broken China Dream, The Broken China Dream, How Reform Revived Totalitarianism. And Min-Shin will also be known to many of you for his various commentaries and columns with leading outlets, including Bloomberg, the Financial Times, and Project Syndicate. So again, thank you so much for being with us. And I mentioned that we want to delve into China's worldview. But let's start from the ground up and maybe explore the most recent round in US-China relations having to do with trade and the prospect, the danger of a trade war. Since Trump's election, we know a year ago, there have been threats of tariffs imposed, renewed threats of new tariffs. And then over the last month, an interesting turn in the run-up to the meeting between Xi and Trump in Korea, South Korea, around the APEC summit. We recall China made it really an unprecedented threat to restrict the exports of rare earths. And it looks as if the move had some consequences as the Trump administration backed off from some of its threats to impose even further tariffs. And both sides came to an interesting agreement to be renegotiated on an annual basis. So just to get us started, and against this backdrop, how do you see these developments over the last year? And what does this back and forth on trade sort of blow and counterblow and uneasy truths tell us about where the US-China relationship is today?
Well, thank you very much, Tom. And also I want to thank Georgetown Americas Institute for inviting me here to speak on US-China relations and also China's role in Latin America and China's worldview. First, to think about the trade war, I think the best analogy is to think of a boxing match. You have two boxers who fought each other before. Now they are in a new match, new fight. One came much better prepared because that particular boxer didn't do well in the last round. One came in much less prepared because he thought he had all the cards, he had all the punches. It did not work out that way because the boxer that was better prepared was a weaker boxer, was not as hefty. Uh, the less well prepared is a better boxer, is a sort of much heftier boxer. So they fought several rounds, at least 3 rounds, if you sort of look at the kind of negotiations the US and China had. It turned out that the weaker boxer but better prepared boxer learned to throw some nasty punches, which the heftier boxer was not prepared for. And so after 3 rounds, they decided to they fought a draw, essentially. They decided to take a break. I think this is where we are. Both countries, now let's just put the analogy aside, both the US and China, through 3 rounds, knew that they were better off pausing the match. But what does that mean going forward? You can look at it 2 ways, and I tend to be more pessimistic. The more optimistic look is perspective is in the 3 rounds or whatever, they were hit pretty hard. They knew the consequences were going to be unpleasant. They're not going to win. Neither side will come out a winner. So because of economic independence, rare earth minerals, for China, that's China's nastiest punch. And the US has a lot of punches, but if you have a knockout punch, 3 knockout punches are as good as just 1 knockout punch. So they've decided to call a truce. They think the optimistic look is that they're not going to resume the fight because nobody would win. But I'm inclined to believe in the much more pessimistic forecast of what's going to happen to the match. That is, both boxers decided, okay, this time I have some vulnerabilities. I'm going to take whatever the time, the pause, I'm going to address these vulnerabilities. And next time when the boxing match resumes, I'm going to knock the other guy out. How long in practical terms this pause will be, it depends on sort of whether you think the US can deal with the critical minerals problem in the next X number of years. Scott Benson very optimistically said it's going to be 12 months to 24 months. Industry experts said 5 years. So whatever you take, I think it will probably be more than 2 years. And 5 years might be. So the good news is that 5 years, we have this pause, which is pretty long in terms of international relations and trade. So the US is going to diversify supplies, invest in resilience. In the meantime, China also knows the US has a lot of punches to throw. So China will deal with software. This is where the US can inflict a huge amount of damage. Civilian aircraft, engines and parts, services. Trade actually is not as trade fight is probably yesterday's war. US-China competition going forward is much less about trade than about technology, because this is where the 2 countries can really hurt each other. So that is, so if the pessimistic forecast is correct, then 4, 5 years from now, we can see a much more nasty fight because both boxers return to the ring thinking that they are much better prepared. They are going to have much less constraints in dealing with each other. So this could be an even nastier fight going forward. The one bright spot, this is where I will end my first and this answer, is that there is one punch neither side threw in the first 3 rounds, and that is security. The Chinese must be very happy to see that Trump is very different from Biden, because Biden was pressing China on the security front very, very tightly. Trump did not use the Taiwan issue. Trump did not actually, security competition was absent from the fight over trade and technology. So this is, I think, a pleasant surprise, and I hope this really continues going forward.
Thank you, and thank you for also placing the current trade dispute in this wider context, the structural competition between US and China that we can trace back, well, decades, of course, but which has intensified over the last 10 years. And we're at this inflection point. You took us 5 years forward. If we're going to start to explore China's worldview and how China sees this competition, let's step back and away from the structural focus. And there is a tendency in this town to think that conflict is inevitable. The US is a hegemon, or has been, maybe still aspires to be. China is a rising power. And when a rising power challenges a hegemon, that's where you've got conflict and the danger of catastrophic war. That's the worldview we're kind of familiar with here in the United States. How does China see it? When I say how does China see it, how does Xi Jinping see it? Because luckily we can make that reduction. Analytically, it simplifies things. He has such an iron grip on power. Let's go a little bit into his worldview. Does China under his leadership aspire to displace the United States as the hegemon? Should a China century follow the American century? What is China's worldview here?
Okay.
Yeah.
Before I answer the question about Xi Jinping's worldview, I want to provide some context. Because in this town, now the conventional wisdom is that this conflict is unavoidable, rising power, incumbent hegemon always have a zero-sum relationship. Incidentally, that view had been popular in China for years. So there is a mirror imaging story here, because I think for China to have this view, for Chinese leaders before Xi Jinping to have this view, it's not surprising, because Chinese leaders are realists. They are schooled in a zero-sum view of great power relations. Now, this country has returned to that perspective. The US has returned to that perspective as well. Why did China have, still China does have that view? That's because China's power has been growing. China has a very different political system. And Chinese leaders for a long time sees the US and its allies in the West as harboring a hidden agenda of regime change. So even though the West was in the middle of this decades-long engagement process with China, Chinese leaders openly, I'm not talking about in private secret speeches, openly said, we cannot trust them. They are A, intent upon changing our political system, and B, they're never going to allow China to rise. For a long time, that was not true, but now this is the reality we face. So there's continuity. So in terms of seeing the US and its allies as an existential threat, Xi is not the first one. What makes Xi different is that his predecessors were not risk takers. His predecessors, even though they had enormous paranoia about the US and the West, were still cautious. They saw China was still weak. China needed to bide its time. But when Xi Jinping came along, he had a much greater risk appetite. He also had a very different perception of American power and China's opportunity. The timing of his rise to power actually makes a huge difference. It's the end of 2012. End of 2012, if you look at the gap between Chinese power and the US power. So I like to cite these numbers. We're just looking at some gap between the US and Chinese GDP using dollars, not PPP. When China opened up, so end of the Maoist era, when Deng Xiaoping became the Chinese leader, Chinese GDP was about 7% of US GDP in dollar terms. So at the end of Cold War, 1992, this is uh, the engagement proposed by the Clinton administration to China. China's GDP was still 7% of the US GDP. So when George W. Bush came to power around 2002-ish, Chinese GDP was about 13% of US GDP. So you already saw sort of almost some closing of the process of closing the gap. When Xi Jinping came to power, Chinese GDP was roughly 50%. The biggest sort of the fastest speed at which China closed the gap was really the post-WTO decade. So when Xi Jinping looked at this, he saw the trajectory is pointing in one direction at the same speed, but also circa 2012, US was in the middle of this great recession after 2008, and the US was mired in two forever wars. So Xi Jinping became very confident, even though I've looked at all his speeches, he never said in public, the East is rising, the West is declining. But when you look at the substance of speeches, that is what he thought. So he saw that there was a historic opportunity. There was this rapid change in the balance of power. The favorite phrase, the sentence he says is, the world is going through changes unseen in a century. I think in many respects that is true, because you have this unprecedented change of power. Uh, the end of an era in which the US was definitely undisputed global hegemon. But it's China's rise, it's also the diffusion of powers, mostly from the developed world to developing world. When you look at the GDP figures, technology, I think we've not looked at technology. When you look at the technology technological landscape at the end of the Cold War and compared today, I think the biggest difference is really the rise of East Asia. Taiwan was nothing in terms of semiconductors. Korea was nothing. Today they're world leaders. And when you look at China, same story. So because he sensed these tectonic shifts in power, and he said, this is our time. And but I think he largely miscalculated. He overestimated Chinese power, because the moment he came to power was also the moment China's economy began to lose momentum for all sorts of reasons. And also that's the moment the US began to recover from the Great Recession. So that is, he underestimated American power, overestimated Chinese power. And I think worst of all, he underestimated American resolve to defend its hegemony. That's because he saw that China was substantial enough.
Yeah.
If it challenges American status as a global hegemon, the US will simply cede its place.
Yes.
And he implemented a set of policies which really amounted to a very direct challenge to American credibility. The most serious is not Belt and Road. It's really the building of artificial islands in the South China Sea. because the US for a long time was the security guarantor of East Asia. And now China did something to show to the US. Now, what can you do? So that's a set of his policies, and on top of these changes, really completely caused the breakdown of US-China relations. Now we're in this hardened, structural, open-ended conflict. So the US-China boxing match is not a conventional boxing match. It does not have any rounds. So they will keep boxing, keep engaging each other until one side forced out. Or optimistically, after an X number of rounds, they're all bloodied, wounded, and say, well, what are we in this for? Let's call it a truce. So we don't know which one, which end we're going to see.
So this, I would say, somewhat pessimistic view from the point of view of prospects for world peace, this view of competition at all levels between the US and China does echo, and this came up in the earlier conversation, the Cold War and its dynamics. Let's talk about the regional implications of your analysis of China's worldview. You mentioned the South China Sea. Taiwan came up again in the earlier panel. First, just a quick question on Taiwan. Should we be worried that China will try over the next couple of years to incorporate Taiwan? And what can the US do about it if that's a real danger?
I think we should not worry too much about a full-on invasion. This is what China wants to do. China's plan has always been to incorporate with a mixture of military, diplomatic coercion, and economic enticements and political dialogue. So China has a set of toolboxes. That policy has not worked uh, 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 for quite a while, but this does not mean China is giving up. But of an invasion, of solving the Taiwan problem by force remains the least preferred option. We should not completely rule it out. But from Beijing's perspective, this is how they look at Taiwan. In discussing the Taiwan issue, I mean, as a Chinese American here, I'm struck by a lot of projection. That is, in this town, U.S. Officials, they talk about Taiwan as if they are Chinese leaders. They project what they might do to Taiwan as if they are Chinese leaders without real evidence to show that Chinese leaders actually think that way. So because I've spent more than 3 decades studying China, I know the Taiwan issue quite well. Chinese leaders look at this from a much more sort of holistic way. That is, Taiwan is a big problem for China. But does it mean that it's a problem they have to solve right away? Just do a thought experiment. If China gets Taiwan tomorrow, what does it bring to China? Do you think it's not that much? But if China has to bring Taiwan into the fold at the cost of a war with the US, at the risk of actually losing an amphibious campaign, that's not worth it. And even if you get Taiwan through force, then you're stuck with the pacification of an island of 23 million people. Most of them are not willing subjects. They're going to wage insurgency. China has trouble dealing with Tibet, dealing with Xinjiang altogether. We're talking about 13, 16 million people. And you go there with very well armed. So I think this is definitely, if you're Chinese leaders, it's a problem they would like to solve it on the cheap. But if it's going to cost, if it's going to derail China's rise, probably they're not going to gamble on it. So this is, I think, because if you, I see this number, 2027. I want to challenge people. Bring me the evidence to say that because These are consequential statements, right? The evidence, if now we're how many years? Well, 2 years away, okay. If China is intent on getting Taiwan back no matter what, whatever the cost, you're going to see the country mobilizing for total war. And that is not a decision Chinese leaders can lightly make. You're going to see
Yes.
a complete reorientation. China is fortifying its economy at a very measured pace. China sees the world as turning in a very dangerous, ugly direction. So it is preparing for this. I think so is the US. And so are American allies, because this is where the world has gone in the last some years. But does this mean that China is about to throw the dice? No. So this said, I would still believe that we can see a different kind of conflict in the Taiwan Strait, for which we should be much better prepared. This is a conflict not caused by deliberate acts, but by mishandling of a very delicate situation, and by China's new strategy, which is because the old strategy has not worked. Taiwan remains defined, de facto independent, now with much more explicit US support, even much less willing to engage in political negotiations with China. So the status quo for China is highly unsatisfactory. The other alternative, as I said, a military conquest, is dangerous, costly, undesirable. So what does China have to do? Because if you're Xi Jinping, if you're Chinese government, you have to do something dealing with this unsatisfactory status quo. So from my perspective, I think there is a new strategy China is adopting, which is short of an act of war, but can still be very dangerous. So they are engaging in an escalating series of gray zone coercion, cutting undersea cables, communication cables, sending jet fighters very close to Taiwan's airspace, conducting large-scale joint exercises that amount to what I would call simulated blockades. These are very, very dangerous actions designed to impose costs on Taiwan. Say, okay, you're not negotiating with us, the status quo is going to be costly for you. So I think this kind of situation actually can cause accidental conflict. American countermeasures designed to deter China can cause Chinese response. So we're facing a very different kind of danger.
See, I was getting hopeful there for a second.
Yeah.
Against the backdrop of this inevitable competition that you see, that the Chinese don't want all-out conflict, that they're cautious. We should not expect aggressive moves. That's all very heartening. At the same time, you finished on a more pessimistic note. The possibility of unintended escalation, misunderstanding is going to be with us for years to come. Let's shift to another regional context, Latin America. And again, we touched on this today in the first session. Latin America is a space for US-China competition. You alluded to the fact that in this town, we tend to project our own historical experience around the world, and maybe particularly in Latin America, and to put a certain read on Chinese intentions in the region. And there's a real reaction against that here under this administration. How does China, Xi Jinping, see Latin America, the rise in trade, the rise in financial investment? Is that primarily an effort to promote growth at home? Or is it part of a grand strategy to displace the United States as the hegemon, even here in the Western Hemisphere?
China sees Latin America primarily as an economic opportunity and secondarily as a geopolitical opportunity, but it's not, the security aspect is missing. because China knows better than thinking about Latin America in security terms. In terms of economic interests, it's a pretty good fit for China, because when you look at what China needs, a huge amount of food, mineral resources, Latin America can provide that. And see what China can do in return. Consumer goods, China is extremely competitive in that space. China is also very competitive in building projects, infrastructure, because over the last 30 years, China has acquired really world-class expertise, capabilities in building infrastructure, because that's how China built its own infrastructure. So it sees, and China has access foreign reserves. China, through its exports, China has a huge amount of foreign reserves that can be invested much more profitably than T-bills, T-notes, American Treasury debt. And for Latin America, I also see they see China as an opportunity, especially South America, because for that region, which has been dominated by U.S. economic, geopolitical, security influence for a long time, they want competition, because the more the competition you have from another part of the world, the more attention you get from Uncle Sam. So this is, I think, sort of the dynamic works that way. So, and over the last, really the story is about sort of 2 decades, you really see the region change. And I think both sides are better off economically. Then geopolitically, China's strategy is that it wants to extend its economic, political influence, because after trade investment, you obviously have closer diplomatic ties. China's view of the global order is this, because I did not cover this one, is that Chinese leaders see the global order created, dominated, led by the West as fundamentally unjust, as fundamentally illegitimate. They've been open about this for a long time, because it cares about interests of the West. It does not take into account of the interests of China and the developing world. So it wants to not necessarily displace the US. I just don't think, because displacing the US takes a lot of resources. And you really need the kind of capabilities only the US has. China just does not. I mean, alliances, right? You also have to have the financial system. You have the kind of technology China is catching up, but not there yet. And also soft power appeal. But China thinks that through patience, through efforts, through economic engagement, it can at least create some kind of parallel order. It's not an order that can displace the West. At least it can create space for other countries that feel disenfranchised. And I have to say that if you're from Global South, probably a lot of Global South countries share that view. Incidentally, when I think about India, China's regional arch rival, if you take the China threat to India out of the picture, a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of interests, the Indian leaders profess or commit to are actually not that different from China's. So I think the one blind spot for the West, for this order, is that they think it's a just order, it's a legitimate order. It serves the West's interests well. As a result, it serves everybody's interests well. The reality is much more complicated. So China sees this as an opportunity. So it's been busy creating a parallel order. And Latin America fits in.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. So we are going to have time for questions. So think of some questions, but we haven't talked enough about AI at this event, don't you think? So
Yeah.
AI is something you've alluded to in terms of technological competition. So I wanted to bring that in, especially in the U.S.-China context. So if we zoom out now from the regional to the global again, um, we know that the U.S. is in the lead. Google, OpenAI, NVIDIA. We know that China is catching up. The gap is closing 3 months, 6 months, a year in areas of hardware, software development. We remember the incredible impact that DeepSeek had earlier this year and waking people up to Chinese progress there. Something those of us who left technology have been following and I think is going to gain much greater public awareness is the Chinese lead, I think we can say, in robotics of all kinds, which is going to be an increasingly important sector, increasingly linked up with AI in so many ways. So what is your sense of the state of the race? Um, and also, to be provocative, are there areas where the US and China might be able to cooperate on AI? Because ultimately, like climate change, this is a global challenge threatening or at least questioning or getting us to raise the issue of what it means to be human in a world where technology is everywhere. And we see AI already changing relationships, friendships, family, community, up to the national and international level. Is there some way to frame AI as a global challenge that we could explore together? Universities, for example, could explore together, acknowledging all our ideological differences, but keeping in mind our shared interests as global humanity.
Uh, I I'm not a specialist on AI. I wish I were. If I were to go to grad school today, I would probably pick AI because it's going to be the future for research. But based on what I have read, this is uh, the state of play is the U.S. still enjoys huge advantage, especially in hardware. The US controls about 75% of the world's computing power. China controls only 15%. So in terms of hardware, it's 5-1. The US is still way ahead. The best models are still the US AI models. The US has more talent. The best sort of AI researchers are still in the US. So if you look at this landscape, it's difficult to claim, as NVIDIA's CEO said a few days ago, that China is going to win the AI race. I think if you make any predictions just based on a static picture, the US is much more likely to win the AI race. But there are sort of two caveats. One is that when you look at the speed of China's catch up, that is very surprising, despite a lot of constraints. Uh, because of US export controls, they don't have the most advanced chips, uh, but they somehow, through ingenuity, through whatever entrepreneurship, they have closed the gap, not completely close, narrow the gap. Uh, they've come, uh, uh, specifically, I think what's interesting in China is that because of export controls, because of their awareness of uh, their constraints, they've embarked on a very different path from the US. The US path is brute force. We're simply going to build gigantic data centers. We're going to put more chips at work. China says, okay, we don't have any chips, so we have to go on a different path. That is, uh, typically they plan to use less computing power to do what they think an adequate job. And second, because the U.S. Relies on sort of proprietary models. That is, you have 5 different companies, each try to come up with uh, the holy grail in AI. China says, okay, this is not what we're going to do. We're going to do the open source. We're going to create a model, a different path that will get a lot more adoptions from the rest of the world. The US might get a holy grail, but this will be a very unique system other countries cannot replicate. So China is on a very different model. And third is that now it comes down to, so what do we mean by win, right? In, in fact, I think the win has not been defined. How do you define is that, are we going to get this of super intelligence, a program or whatever that can be smarter than human beings, that can do everything for us? This seems to be the current definition for the ultimate victory. So this can be one win. But another much more near-term practical win is that we use whatever tools, or AI tools we have, we actually improve what we do, especially in routine economic activities. So China is sort of has picked that route out of necessity, not out of its desire, because the super intelligence model is out of reach because it does not have the hardware. So we'll see which one. What I can say is that both countries have made huge bets on two very different approaches to AI. Whether one country will actually win, it's really too early to tell. So now, in terms of cooperation, I think ideally two countries should cooperate because the US and China are leaders. So, and AI has maybe the next best thing, but can also have huge risks for humanity, for all kinds of things. And so, in the ideal world, they should cooperate. They should discuss regulatory framework, discuss mutual concerns. But in the real world, this is not going to happen because they see AI just a new front, as a new front for US-China strategic rivalry. Which country goes there, gets there first, will be in an unassailable position. So this is simply not going to happen. But I think one possible solution is that I cannot think of any bilateral forum for a productive, substantive discussion involving US and US and Chinese scientists, policymakers. But I think we can do this in a much more neutral venue. Europe, Asia, especially Korea, where sort of the mutual suspicion can somehow be mitigated by the presence of scientists and policymakers that do not feel as intensely about the competition as just US and China.
Maybe Latin America.
Latin America,
Let's
yes.
let's be creative. All right, we have some time for questions. We have a mic here. Please stand up, come to the mic, and briefly introduce yourself and pose a question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Eduardo Porter. I would be interested in hearing a bit more. Thanks very much for the great comments, by the way. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about this idea of what China has to offer other countries in the global south and other parts of the world, as an offer to bring them in, to pry them away, perhaps from the Western canon. I too I've even written about, this is a great moment of opportunity for China, but I don't really see that it's taking it. I mean, what can I see that China has offered countries, say in Latin America, where I'm from? Well, money, infrastructure investment, currency swaps, inviting them into the brick and road. That's all very good, but it doesn't look to me like inviting somebody into a different system with different rules or a different perception of what's, the global good. And on the other hand, I still see China engaging in what looks like a mercantilistic economic policies that could actually do some damage to the industrial structures of many other countries by, these massive Chinese exports. Imports from Chinese goods to Mexico have been risen drastically over the last 2 or 3 years, and you're getting a lot of complaints from their manufacturing companies. So I don't really quite see China taking advantage of this opportunity, and I'd like to see what you see the tools that could be deployed.
Yeah. Uh, if China changes policy, it can sort of be of enormous assistance or value to the global south. Uh, Unfortunately, so far we have not seen. So, but if you leave aside uh, sort of all these problematic behavior by China, and uh, there are a lot of things China has done that should be criticized because it's, as you said, quite mercantilist, uh, quite self-centered. Uh, so if, but on the other hand, you have to ask this question, and I don't have answers, and I don't see real objective studies. Has Chinese economic engagement with the global south been a net benefit or a net cost? I think this is a pretty good question to ask. I have not seen good answers. You can, I think, in very specific field sectors, uh, you can make a more positive statement. I think where there is less disagreement is clean energy. I think the, the global south is much better off today thanks to China's low cost clean energy. Uh, I would say in some respects, infrastructure is a very mixed picture. I think some infrastructure projects China has helped finance and build probably are of real economic value. A lot of them are white elephants. I think much more controversial is really the problem of outcompeting local industries. I think this is a problem very difficult for China to solve because uh, uh, China's real uh, competitive advantage is really manufacturing. But this is a field where developing countries become wealthier historically through the manufacturing path. But if you have this global manufacturing superpower gobbling up the opportunities because China is really competitive in that space, then how can you help the global south? So I think there's a lot of uh, room for China to improve. But if they see, but global south in China's overall grand strategy is very important because it sees U.S. and its allies as the markets of yesterday. The global south is the markets of tomorrow. But if you do not actually pay the price for engagement, then you're unlikely to succeed. I think that is a question Beijing needs to ask and answer. But thank you for raising it.
Thank you. Rolando? Here's a mic or, yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Very enlightening. You mentioned clean energy.
Yeah.
I'll give you some examples because we deal a lot with Chinese companies
Yes.
in solar panels and in BESS battery energy storage
Yes, yes.
systems, in windmills. We've bought a lot of Chinese equipment. And I should point out that not only are they very good price, but the technical support they come with is excellent. When we have had this experience in the Dominican Republic, in Jamaica, in Panama, and in where else? Oh, in some of the smaller islands in the Caribbean, we have bid equipment that used to be worth 8 times more when we started than it is today. So competitively they've adapted to the market and brought prices down. In battery systems, I had one of my partners is the AES Corporation and manufactures through one of their divisions, Fluence battery energy storage systems. And the price of Huawei equipment is about half of what the American version of that is. So that's one of the advantages that I think China has brought to the renewable energy market, and it's prevailed throughout Latin America.
Thank you.
Thank you for the data point.
Yeah. Other questions? Comments? We have time for one more question. Here we go. Yeah, please come up to the mic. Yeah.
My name's James Markulitis. I'm here with some of my colleagues from IPA, Innovations for Poverty Action, the Peace and Recovery Program. You had talked a little bit about American soft power and how that's kind of one of our strengths relative to China around the world. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the impacts on American soft power versus China in the last 10 months, where a lot of countries have kind of, or people have seen that the US kind of not living up to its democratic values, one of our core tenets of our soft power. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how China kind of views this moment of potential disruption in American soft power, and how they're kind of utilizing this moment. Are they acting upon it, weaponizing it, or are they kind of just sitting back and watching it? Love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Last 10 months, I think we witnessed a period, a very unique, strange period in which the US soft power has been eroded, degraded by its own policies. There's just no question, just across a whole range, USAID, climate, immigration policy, and as well as the dysfunction of the domestic politics, the erosion of the rule of law. So I think there's absolutely no questions that last 10 months, Xi Jinping and his colleagues must be very happy to see that what we cannot do to the US is doing to itself at a speed nobody could have imagined. So this, I think that is a fact very few people would deny. But that now, can China utilize this window of opportunity? China has gained some grudging international respect. Using the boxing analogy, it stood up to a much more powerful boxer and fought the boxer to a draw. And remember, all the other countries got into the ring, and the first thing they did was to kneel down, kiss the ring. They don't even bother to fight, and other countries say, okay. So China actually stood up to a very powerful adversary. So I think China gained some grudging respect that way. But otherwise, China has a lot of baggage. That is, in this competition, America's loss of soft power does not mean China's gain of soft power. Because if you look at China, it is still on the side of Russia, supporting an unjust, brutal war of aggression against a medium-sized, a weak neighbor, and that has done China a lot of damage. And China has not really done anything to change that image, and China's own domestic political situation is not giving people a lot more hope and confidence, right? Well, the rule of law is being eroded, but there's no rule of law in China whatever. So I just do not think that China is in a good position to increase its soft power. But I think it's a tragedy that decades of American soft power are being sort of squandered away needlessly.
Well, we tried to end on hopeful notes.
Yeah.
We don't have time to do that now, but we do have panels this afternoon, and hope you all will stick around for those. In the meantime, we invite you to enjoy conversation over lunch right in this room. And thank you for being here this morning. We've had two tremendous conversations, and the conversation we just concluded on China really, I think, built beautifully on the earlier one this afternoon. It's going to be a great day-long conversation. And now I'd like to thank you for being here, but also ask you to thank Min-Shin Pei for a wonderful presentation. That was super.
We now invite you to join us for a buffet lunch here in Copley Formal Lounge. We will restart the conference at 2:30 with our keynote address, Technology and Global Inequality in the Age of AI, featuring Nobel laureate Simon Johnson. Please join us again at 2:30.